The stone came out of the crowd sideways, half a brick of kiln-fired ballast, and Marin Solis saw it the way you see lightning, after it had already happened. One moment her daughter was pressed against her hip in the crush of the ration riot, and the next a wall of gray plates stepped over Pia like a gate swinging shut, and the brick broke against it with a crack that Marin felt in her own teeth. The wall was alive. It was the alien from Saltern Row, the huge one, the one mothers in Drey's Hollow used to make their children come inside before dark. It did not cry out. It did not even flinch in the direction the brick had come from. It curled forward over Pia with its arms spread like the ribs of an upturned boat, and the riot broke around it the way floodwater breaks around a bridge piling. Marin had time to think, absurdly, that she had never seen it this close. Then the market square heaved again. The riot had started over grain. Everyone would argue later about whose shout had been first, but the arithmetic was simple enough. The blight had taken a third of the terrace harvest on Meridian Shelf. The Colonial Allotment Office had cut the Hollow's ration share by half instead of a third, and somebody at the way station had decided market day was the right morning to post the notice. By the time Marin understood that the crowd around the grain stalls had stopped being a queue and started being a single animal, she was already inside it, with a 6-pound bag of patch fasteners for the shop in one hand and her daughter's wrist in the other. She lost the fasteners in the first surge. She nearly lost Pia in the second. A man went down 2 arms lengths away and did not come up. A stall collapsed with a sound like a ship docking badly. Somewhere near the way station, glass broke in a long, ragged scream of it, and the crowd answered the glass with a roar. And that was when the throwing started. Cobbles, bottles, a chair leg turning end over end above the heads of people too packed together to duck. Pia's hand was torn out of hers. Marin would carry the next 4 seconds for the rest of her life. The way other people carried scars, they showed no one. Her daughter, small and red-scarfed, spinning away in a gap between bodies. A drover's boot coming down where a small foot had been. The brick, rising from somewhere near the burned-out fountain, beginning its flat, ugly arc toward the gap where her daughter stood, and the gray shape coming through the crowd, not around people but through the spaces they didn't know they had, faster than anything that size had a right to move, folding itself over a human child it had never met as if it had rehearsed her whole life for it. The brick broke. The crowd surged. The grayback stayed exactly where it was, a boulder in a river, and Marin fought her way to it, screaming her daughter's name with a voice she did not recognize. The alien turned its head. Not its body. Its body did not move an inch off the line between Pia and the crowd, just its head, on a thick-plated neck. And for a heartbeat, Marin looked into its eyes from less than an arm away. She had heard everything about the Saltern Row alien, that it had broken a dock worker's arm in 3 places for getting too near its den, that it pulled freight carts for the Crook Market crews at night because honest work wouldn't have it, that it stood 7 feet in the rain and didn't blink. Nobody had told her its eyes were amber and enormous, and that what lived in them, this close, was not menace at all but a terrible patient bracing. The look of a creature that fully expected the next blow to come from her and had decided to take that one too. "She's mine," Marin gasped. "She's mine, that's my daughter." The alien moved. One arm uncurled and Pia came out from under it like a chick from under a wing, untouched, both shoes still on, the red scarf gone from her neck somewhere in the crush, her face white and her eyes huge but her body whole. The gray hand that delivered her was bigger than the child's entire back. It held her the way Marin held eggs from the cold box, and then it let go and put itself between them and the square again. Militia whistles cut over the noise from the tannery roadside. 3 shrill blasts and then a 4th, dispersal order, batons out. "Wait," Marin said to the alien's back. "Wait, you're bleeding." There was a dark seam down the plate of its shoulder where the brick had glanced after breaking, a thin tar-colored line. Her own voice astonished her. The square was still a riot. Her daughter was still shaking against her ribs, and she was reaching toward the monster of Saltern Row with her open hand as if it were one of Pia's spooked cats. It looked at her hand. It looked at her face. Something went through its amber eyes that she would spend weeks trying to name and finally settle on the only word that fit, which was practice. The swift, dead calm practice of a creature that had run this exact arithmetic many times before and never once liked the answer. "They throw better when you stand still," it said. Its voice was so low she felt it in her sternum more than heard it. Gravel dragged over gravel. The words carefully spaced like a child reciting in a borrowed language. Then it was gone. Not fled gone, the way smoke leaves a doorway. It dropped low, and the crowd that could not move for anyone moved for it, peeled apart along seams of pure fear, and the gray shape went through the gap between the fish stalls and over the harbor rail with one hand and was simply not there anymore. The whole exit took less time than the militia took to cross half the square. A stall keeper grabbed Marin's arm. Varric, the dry goods man, blood on his ear, eyes bright with the particular joy of a man who has found someone to blame. "You saw it," he panted. "You saw the brute, right in the middle of it. I'll swear to the militia it started the whole thing, the Xeno, I'll swear it and you'll back me. Mrs. You saw." Marin looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the militia line came up the square at a walk, batons clacking on shields in slow time, and the riot died as fast as it had been born. People remembering, all at once, that they were neighbors with allotment cards and back rent. "What I saw," she said, "is somebody threw a brick at my daughter, and the only body in this whole square that did anything about it has gray plates, and a tar line down its shoulder where the brick landed." Varric's face shut like a ledger. "It'll be on the list by morning," he said. "Riot like this, they'll clear the row of every unplaced Xeno on the shelf, and good riddance. You want my advice. You keep that soft talk indoors." He was right about the list. He was right by 9 o'clock the next morning. The notice went up on the militia board, the allotment board, and the door of the office for displaced persons, which occupied 2 rooms over the assay house and had until that week mostly concerned itself with lost luggage and expired transit chits. Order of the Town Council of Drey's Hollow, it read, pursuant to the events of Market Day. All unplaced non-human minors and vagrant Xeno persons residing within town bounds to be registered, assessed, and removed to transit holding pending labor fosterage placement. By authority of the council. First sweep in 14 days. Marin read it twice, standing in the rain with her shop keys in her hand. Labor fosterage. She knew what that meant on Meridian Shelf. Everyone did. It meant the upcountry dredge camps and the peat farms. It meant a cot and 2 meals against 10 hours of haul work. It meant 14-year contracts signed by an office on behalf of beings who could not read them. It was the word orphan fed through a machine that spat out the word asset. "Vagrant Xeno-persons," she said aloud, to nobody. The rain dripped off the board. Somewhere under the harbor, in whatever hole it slept in, was a creature with a tar-colored seam down its shoulder that it had taken for a human child whose name it didn't even know. She went and opened the shop because the shop didn't open itself. But her hands did the work that day while her head walked around and around a gray shape folded over her daughter like a gate, and the low voice saying they throw better when you stand still, which was not the sentence of a brute when you turned it over. It was the sentence of a being that had been thrown at so many times it had a theory. 3 days after the riot, the scarf came back. It was Pia who found it, because Pia was the one who flew out the gate every morning ahead of her satchel. She came back in at a dead run, shouting, and Marin came off the shop ladder with her heart already moving. And there it was, folded on the gatepost cap. Pia's red scarf. Lost in the crush of a riot in a square a half-mile away, trampled, gone, and now folded. Not draped, not snagged. Folded in quarters, corners squared like a soldier's kit, with a flat harbor stone set on top of it so the wind wouldn't have it again. It had been washed. That was the part that undid her. Somewhere between the market square and her gatepost, somebody had washed a child's scarf in cold water and dried it and folded it, and had then come up Brindle Lane in the dark past 40 human houses to return it without knocking, without waiting, without leaving anything that asked for anything. "It was him," Pia said with 6-year-old certainty, hopping on one foot. "The big gray one, he remembered me. It could have been anyone, little fish. It was him." Pia took the scarf and wound it around her neck twice proudly. He folded it. Big hands fold big. Look how big the folds are. Marin looked at the folds. She thought about a dockworker's arm broken in 3 places. She thought about every story she'd swallowed whole from people who had needed, for their own comfort, the largest creature in the hollow to also be the worst one. She thought about 14 days, now 11. That evening she banked the stove, left Dario frowning over greenhouse manifests with Pia drawing at his elbow, and told them she was going to check the shop locks. Then she walked the other way, down through the fish smoke and the lamplit drizzle, to Saltern Row. The row after dark was a place humans left to itself. It had been cannery land once before the new processor went in across the harbor. Now it was a quarter-mile of gutted brick sheds, rust-blelled and roofless in stretches, where the hollow put everything it did not want to look at. The Crook Market crews ran goods through the north end. The middle was given over to whatever slept rough. At the south end, the old boiler house still held its chimney up against the sky like a finger marking a place in a book nobody read anymore. She felt eyes the whole way and saw nothing. That was the row's etiquette. You were observed, and the observation was the warning. It took her 3 nights to find him. The first night she found only signs. A crate stacked on a crate to make a windbreak. The cold ring of an old fire with the ash raked tidily into a pail, which struck her as heartbreaking in a way she couldn't explain to Dario afterward. Vagrants did not rake their ash into pails. Children who had once had mothers raked ash into pails. The second night she found the watcher the row had sent to look at her. A human, wire-thin, 16 at most. perched on a wall with a bowhook across his knees like a scepter. He watched her come and watched her go and answered exactly one question. She asked where the big Vurok slept, and he laughed at her with all his teeth and said, "Anywhere it wants, missus," which was the town's whole understanding of the creature in 9 words. The third night, she stopped looking for the alien and started looking the way she'd look for a child, for warmth, for water, for the place you'd choose if every living thing you met threw something. And so she found the boiler house, and the flue alcove behind it where the bricks still held the day's heat long after dark, and the gray shape wedged into that warm slot with its knees to its chest and its back to the open ground, exactly the way Pia slept when the dreams were bad. It was awake before she'd made a sound. She knew because the stillness changed quality, sleep stillness becoming wall stillness. The amber eyes opened and found her in the dark without searching. She stopped 10 feet away. She set down what she had brought, a covered tin of mutton and barley stew, still hot, and a horn spoon, and stepped back from it the way you step back from a trap you were trying to prove wasn't one. "My daughter," she said, "is the one with the red scarf." Nothing moved. The flue ticked, cooling. "You folded it," Marin said. "You washed a little girl's scarf in harbor water, and you folded it, and you walked it up Brindle Lane past every house that hates you, and you set a stone on it so it would still be there in the morning. So either everything this town says about you is true, and you're also the strangest monster ever born, or none of it is, and you've just been the only one keeping the books straight." The eyes watched her. Deep under the silence she heard, felt a sound like a cart passing 3 streets over, and understood it was the creature breathing. "There's an order posted," she said. 14 days from market day they sweep the row. Anyone unplaced gets sent up to the dredge camps, and they'll call it fosterage, and you will haul mud until the contract says you're old, and nobody will ever ask you a single question about what you wanted. 11 days now. Her voice came out rougher than she planned. "I'm telling you because I watched my whole town decide what you are in one morning, off one brick that somebody else threw, and I held the other end of that arithmetic. My girl is alive, so whatever you are, you've got a creditor, and she lives on Brindle Lane, and I pay what I owe." She'd rehearsed more. A plan, an offer, the word that had been growing in her all 3 nights, the insane word, the word stay. None of it survived contact with those eyes. She turned to go. The voice came after her, low as bilge water, careful as a first lesson. "Don't come at dark," it said. "Dark is when they check what I'm worth." She stopped. "Who checks?" But the warm slot behind the boiler house was empty. The stew tin was gone with it, and the horn spoon left behind, set upright in a crack of the brick, the way you'd leave a marker. Or the way, she thought, as she walked home with rain in her eyes, you'd return the one part of a kindness you weren't sure you were allowed to keep. The next morning the spoon was on her gatepost, washed under a flat harbor stone. And the morning after that, when the first hard frost of the season came down off the upcountry like a dropped blade and the hollow's gutters frozen ropes, Marin Sola stood at her shop window, watching her breath fog the glass, and made the kind of decision that doesn't feel like one, that feels, when it finally arrives, like something that was always there being uncovered. She closed the shop at noon. She filled the big jug with broth and packed the rest of yesterday's loaf meal, took Dario's old storm coat off its peg. He was the only one in the house with shoulders even in the neighborhood of useful, and walked into Saltern Row in broad daylight, where everyone could see, because she had decided overnight that being seen was the entire point. Let them look. Let every window on Tannery Road fill up with faces. The cold had emptied the row of watchers. Her boots cracked ice in the cart ruts the whole quarter mile, and the boiler house, when she reached it, had lost its last heat sometime in the night. The flue alcove's brick was dead cold under her bare hand. The gray shape was still in it. Wrong, was her first thought. The shape was wrong, knees down instead of up, the great back not braced against the open ground but slumped along it. And the frost had laced the plates of its shoulders white, and it did not become a wall when she came close. It barely became awake. The amber eyes opened to slits, found her, failed to focus, and in a low ruined gravel the creature that the whole of Drey's Hollow crossed streets to avoid said something in its own tongue. 3 notes, down, down, up, the most naked sound she'd ever heard from a living thing. And then, recognizing her in careful trade, "Don't, they'll see, they'll cost you." "Let them," said Marin, and knelt on the frozen brick, and got the storm coat around shoulders wider than the coat had ever dreamed of, and put the broth jug into hands that could crush her own and which closed around the warm clay as gently as around a folded scarf. "Drink that, all of it. Then you're going to lean on me, and we're going to walk up Brindle Lane in the middle of the day, and you're going to sleep behind a door that locks." The huge head moved side to side slow, the universal no. "I break things," it said. "It's what I'm for. Ask anyone." "I'm asking you." A long silence. Frost ticked off the plates as the coat's warmth got into them. When the answer finally came, it was barely a sound at all, the gravel gone small, and it was the moment Marin Solis stopped thinking of the Sultan Row alien as it forever, because no one in the history of the word had ever asked a question like this one, in this voice, with this much practice at the answer being no. Behind the door, he said, "Which side do I sleep? Tell me which side I guard." "You don't guard anything," she said. "You're a child, you sleep." The amber eyes closed. "I don't know how to do that," said the monster of Drey's Hollow. "Show me." The walk up Brindle Lane took 20 minutes and cost the Solis family, by Marin's later count, roughly half their standing in the hollow before they even reached the gate. He leaned on her the whole way, which meant a creature half a ton in weight, pretending that a 130-pound woman was holding him up, taking exquisite care to put no weight on her at all while looking to every window on the lane like he had taken her hostage. Doors opened and shut. Varric's sister stood on her step with her hand over her mouth. Old Hannum, who'd been a foreman before his knees went, called out, "Marin Solis, are you mad?" with real fear in it. Fear for her, which was somehow worse than spite. "Probably," she called back and kept walking. Dario was in the yard when they came through the gate. He had a grafting knife in his hand, and Marin watched her husband, a careful man, a man who read contracts twice, take in the storm coat, the frost-laced plates, the sheer cliff-face size of what his wife had brought home, and set the knife down on the bench. Open hands, slow movements. He'd grown up around spooked draft animals, and it showed, and she could have kissed him for it. "Well," Dario said, "he's not sleeping in the greenhouse. The heat ducts are barely keeping the seedlings alive as it is." "The back room," Marin said. "The workshop cot." "The cot," her husband said, looking at the shoulders, "will be a brave little piece of furniture." He stepped forward and held out his hand. "Palm up, Dario. You took a brick that was aimed at my daughter. I'm told the polite ones say something at this point, but anything I say is going to be too small, so we'll call it said." The gray hand came out slowly and covered Dario's whole forearm, and shook it once, with a precision that made Marin's eyes sting. The practiced precision of a being that had measured exactly how much of itself the world could take, and lived a fraction under that line. Pia came around the corner of the house at a dead run, saw him, and did not slow down at all. Marin's heart went into her mouth, and the giant dropped. That fast, that smooth, down onto one knee and then lower, folding joint by joint, until his eyes were under the level of a 6-year-old's, until the most feared silhouette on Meridian's shelf had made itself smaller than a child and held very, very still, the way you hold still for a wren. Pia stopped a foot away. She looked him over with the frank audit of the very young. "Your shoulder still got a mark," she announced. "From my brick." "It was not your brick," he said gravely, gravel gone soft as it could go. "You were only standing where it wanted to go. I'm Pia." A pause. The amber eyes flicked up to Marin, then back. Asking, she realized. Asking if it was allowed here to have one. "Teo," he said. It was the first time anyone in Drey's Hollow had heard his name. The town had managed in 2 full years never once to ask. He had been on Sultan Row 2 years. Marin assembled that much over the first days, in fragments, because he answered direct questions and volunteered nothing. He ate astonishingly little for his size. Vurak ran slow and deep. Omases would tell her later, like peat fires, and he ate it only after everyone else had started, and he washed the dish before he was done swallowing. The cot he reinforced himself silently, with 2 struts salvaged from the shop scrap pile, and he asked permission before touching the scrap. He asked permission before touching anything. A being that could fold a stove flat asked, every single morning, whether he might use the kettle. He broke nothing. In a house cluttered with a 6-year-old's glass marbles and Dario's seedling trays and shelf upon shelf of shop stock, in 14 days he broke not one thing. And Marin began to understand that the carefulness wasn't fear. It was older than fear. Somewhere someone had taught him that his body was a debt the world collected on sight, and he had organized his entire life around carrying it without spilling. He slept, when he finally slept, on the floor beside the cot rather than in it, with his back to the family rooms and his face to the window, to the gate, to the street. The first time Marin got up before dawn and found him like that, plates frost gray in the half-light, eyes already open. Watching the lane, she stood in the doorway with her chest aching and made herself say it plainly. "Nobody is coming up that lane, Teo." "Someone is always coming up the lane," he said. Not an argument, a weather report from a place she'd never lived. It took her until the 8th day to learn how right he was. She'd gone down to the harbor offices to see Omases, because the Office for Displaced Persons had rejected her petition in 9 minutes flat, and she needed to understand the species she was fighting for. Omases was the closest thing the hollow scatter of Vurak dockhands had to an elder, a female, plates gone the color of driftwood, who ran the tide tally at the 3rd pier and was tolerated by the wharfingers because she was never wrong about water. She received Marin in the lee of a crane shed, listened without once interrupting, and then said the thing that rearranged everything. "You are calling him a young male," Omasess said. "Why? Because the size of him we armor early. The plates come at the 3rd year, and the body builds to carry them, all at once like a roof going on before the walls are done." The old eyes, paler amber than Teo's, held hers. "Humans read mass as age. It gets our children killed." The Hollow has spent 2 years measuring his shoulders and deciding what he must have done to deserve them. She let the silence sit. "By the reckoning of his own blood, the one sleeping on your workshop floor is younger than the daughter he shielded." Marin stood in the crane shed's shadow while the harbor went on shouting and swinging cargo behind her, and did the arithmetic she had been refusing to do. The folded scarf, the raked ash, the which side do I guard, the I don't know how to do that, show me, and the picture that assembled was not a feared brute softening. It was a small child in a vault's body, who had been alone on the coldest street of a foreign town since an age when human children were still learning their letters, and whom 400 adults had looked at every day for 2 years and seen a weapon. "How does a Vurok child end up alone on the shelf?" she asked, when she could. "The same way your harbor ends up with driftwood." Omasess turned back to her tally board. The war contracts took the grown ones. Conscript labor, the deep mines on Etero, the line fortifications, they paid the passage of the young ones nowhere. Cargo manifests do not list what crawls out of an empty hold. He came off a grain hauler in his first plates alone. I gave him the rule we give all our young here. She tapped the board once hard. Be useful. Be silent, be elsewhere. It keeps them breathing. It also teaches every human who looks at them exactly the wrong lesson. I want to change the lesson, Marin said. The registry told me this morning that a human family can't hold fosterage over a non-human minor without a species sponsor of standing. Whatever that is, I need one. For the first time, the driftwood plates shifted, the long, slow rearrangement that Marin would learn to read as Vurok laughter or its grave cousin. Standing, Omasess said, I tally tides human. The registry will weigh my standing against a council order and a contractor's purse, and I know which way that scale tips. You should know it too before you spend your family on this. The pale eyes came back up. But come back when it is time, and I will put my name where it can be refused out loud. Our children watch what the old ones do. Refusals should cost witnesses. The Office for Displaced Persons had been given a new officer for the sweep. Her name was Etta Marsh. She had come down from the provincial seat at Carthan with 2 clerks and a strong box of blank forms. And she was, Marin judged after their first 9 minutes, neither cruel nor kind. She was procedural, the way a winch is procedural. Petition denied. No species sponsor. Subject classification, unplaced xenominer, presumptive laborer grade, disposition. Transit holding, first sweep, with placement to follow per council contract. The council contract, Marin had repeated. Placement with whom? Marsh had consulted nothing. She knew her file. Garen Pike holds the labor fosterage tender. The dredge works. Heavy grade subjects are wanted for the winter cut on the long berm. She'd looked up then and offered what she plainly believed was reassurance. The big ones do well at the dredge, Mistress Solis. Steady work, fed twice a day. It is a better outcome than the street. He has an outcome. He has a room in my house. He has a classification, said Etta Marsh and stamped the form. And that was the 9th minute. Garen Pike, Marin thought on the walk home. Everyone on the shelf knew Pike the way you knew weather. He'd held the harbor dredge contract for a decade, lost 2 barges to his own corner cutting, and had spent the autumn lobbying the council for the winter cut along the long berm, the earthwork that stood between the hollow's lower streets and the tidal river. Pike had been in the council gallery, someone told her, the day the removal order passed. Pike had in fact helped draft the wording, unplaced xenominers to labor fosterage. He hadn't even been subtle. He'd stood at the assay house door while the notice went up, working a toothpick, pricing the row's children by the shoulder like a man at a stock fair. There were, by the militia's own register, 11 unplaced xenominers in Drey's Hollow. 10 were small, kit-sized, scrap-thin, the kind that survived by being beneath notice. And then there was the 11th, the heavy-grade subject, the prize of the whole sweep, asleep on her workshop floor with his face to the gate. The first ones to come up the lane were not the militia. They were 2 men from the Crook Market end of the row, and they came on the 11th day into the shop, in the slack hour after lunch, a wiry one with a both-hook scar across his jaw, and a wide one who stayed by the door and touched nothing in the deliberate way of a man being paid to be noticed touching nothing. Mrs., the wiry one said pleasantly, you've got crew of ours up at your house. I've got a child of mine up at my house. That's a thing I'd heard. And I told Harrow, I said, she can't mean it, a sensible shopkeeping woman. He strolled the middle aisle, reading shelves. The ox is marked, Mrs. Crew mark, right shoulder plate, 2 years standing. Harrow fed it when it was fresh off the boat, and Harrow's mark means Harrow's claim. That's the whole law of the row. and there's wagons want pulling and doors want minding before the sweep eats everything, so. He smiled with most of his teeth. Send it home, and the rose stays sweet on you. Keep it, and, well, a shop is just a stack of things that break when you think about it. Always thought that was sad. The mark was real, she'd seen it. A brand burn the size of her palm, low on the right shoulder plate, an angular sigil scarred pale into the gray. She had asked Teo about it exactly once, and he had gone so still for so long that she had taken the question back out loud the way you'd take back a dropped knife. Tell Harrow, Marin said now evenly, that the mark is on a shoulder plate, and Varrock molt their plates. The wiry man laughed. The wide one at the door did not, because the door behind him had filled. There had been no sound. That was what hollowed the two of them out. She saw it happen. No footstep, no creak, just a change in the light, and Teo standing in the shop doorway with a delivery crate under one arm, having come down from the house on the errand she'd sent him on an hour ago. He did not posture. He did not speak. He set the crate down on the counter with the deliberate softness of a man laying down a sleeping infant, and then he simply stood there, filling the doorway he'd been invited through 100 times, and looked at the wide man from a distance of 3 feet, and the wide man who was, Marin realized this close to him, not wide at all, took his shoulder off the doorframe and found somewhere else for his hands. Tev, the wiry one said, heartiness gone thin as ice over a well. Good to see you fed. Her floors is swept, Teo said, in that bilge-deep gravel, each word laid down separately. Nothing in this shop breaks, that was all. 2 sentences, neither of them a threat by any grammar a magistrate could parse, and the 2 men angled themselves around the doorway's margins and out into the lane, the wiry one walking with the careful gait of a man minding his own spine, and Marin let out a breath and discovered her hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her until she understood why. It was the first time in 11 days she had seen what the rest of the hollow swore it saw when it looked at him, and even now, the difference. The town saw a weapon at rest. What had stood in her doorway was a wall, and a wall has a side. She had just watched for the first time in her life somebody choose to be in front of her. They'll come back, she said. Yes. He picked the crate back up, finishing the errand. Harrow doesn't lose stock. He sells it or he sinks it. A pause. The amber eyes found the window, the lane, the harbor beyond it. You should know what the mark cost him to put on me. 1 meal. I was 4 days off the boat and I hadn't eaten in 3. Another pause longer. It was a good meal, he said, with no irony whatsoever, and carried the crate to the back room. And Marin stood at her own counter and pressed her knuckles hard against the wood and hated, with a pure cold hatred that frightened her, a man she had never met, who bought children for the price of 1 bowl, and a town that had watched him do it for years and saved its fear for the children. The Hollow's answer to the Solis family arrived in pieces, the way weather does. First it was custom. The shop's morning bell, which rang 20 times before noon on any honest day, rang 4 times on the 12th day and twice on the 13th. Old accounts went quiet. The harbor master's wife, who had bought her lamp wicks from Marin for 9 years, crossed Tannery Road to buy them from a stall that didn't sell lamp wicks, and stood there negotiating for something the stallholder had to send a boy to fetch, rather than pass the Solis window at a normal pace. Then it was Dario. The greenhouse cooperative met on the 14th day and voted to defer his winter seedling contract, a third of the family's income deferred, with no second date offered. The cooperative's secretary, a decent man named Imber, who had stood up at Dario and Marin's wedding, delivered the news on their doorstep with his hat in both hands and his eyes on the step. It's the members, Dar. They've got children, they say. They see that thing in your yard and... That thing, Dario said, carries water to my seedlings every morning at 5 so I can sleep an extra hour. It carried a fever-sick neighbor's coal up Brindle Lane on Thursday because the coalman wouldn't bring his cart past our gate. Look up from the step, Imber. Look at my face. You've known it 20 years. Tell my face what they say their children are afraid of. Imber looked up. He was not a bad man. That was the lesson Marin was learning faster than any other. How little badness the machine actually required. They're not afraid of what he'll do, he said at last, miserably. They're afraid of getting used to him. There's a difference, and it's worse, and I can't do a thing about either. I'm sorry. Then it was Pia. She came home from the lane school on the 16th day with her knuckles skinned and her collar torn and a look on her. Small face that Marin knew from mirrors. Otto Varick's boy, 2 years older and a head taller, had stood on the school wall and announced that Pia Solis lived in a barn now, that her mother had taken in the Xeno that started the riot, that his father said the Solis house had picked monsters over people, and everyone should remember it. Pia, by the testimony of 3 delighted witnesses, had not cried. She had recited, word for word, at parade volume, the militia's own incident report which Marin had read aloud at the dinner table once. No charge brought against any Varrock subject. Projectile thrown from the crowd by person or persons unknown. Then the Varick boy had called Teo a gutter ox, and Pia had hit him, and it had taken 2 teachers to peel her off. You can't hit people for words. Marin said that evening, kneeling to clean the knuckles, keeping her voice in the stern register the moment required, while something traitorous in her chest sang. He's not an ox, Pia said. He folds scarves. Pia. They make him stand in the rain, her daughter said, suddenly not fierce at all. Suddenly 6, with her chin going crumpled. Before. At the market. Before I saw, everyone saw. The awning man pushed him out from under the awning into the rain, and nobody said anything, and he just went. He's so big, and he just went. And now he lives with us and folds things, and they're still. She ran out of words and hit the table with her small fist, and the bafflement in her face was the oldest question there was, and Marin had no answer for it that wasn't a lie, so she pulled her daughter into her shoulder and held on. Across the kitchen, in the doorway of the back room, a gray shape stood very still. He'd heard all of it. He heard everything. His hearing went down through floors and through walls, and she suspected, through years. Marin met his eyes over Pia's head and watched him learn, in real time, with visible disbelief, what it did to him that the small one had hit somebody. Not that she'd been hurt for him, that she'd thought he was worth her knuckles. She should not fight, he said later when Pia slept. He was at the window again, face to the lane. I'm not worth her hands. Her hands are small. Her hands are hers, Marin said. She decides what they're worth spending on. That's the whole house rule. It applies to you too. He turned that over for a long time. The harbor light swung its slow bar of white across the ceiling and away. In the row, he said, everything I am worth is decided by other people. Harrow decided. The militia decided. The awning man decided. His plates moved. The long, slow shift, she'd learned, was the Verrock shrug. Your house has strange law. It's called a family, Teo. I know the word, he said, in his gravel very quietly. I have seen them through windows. The window glass broke on the 19th night. Not theirs. The shop's. The big mullion pane that Marin's mother had paid a half-year's profit to glaze, smashed inward across the dry goods shelves with a cobble wrapped in paper, and on the paper, in the blocky, deniable capitals of every coward's note ever written, monsters out. The militia constable who came at dawn took the cobble, took her statement, looked at the glass with his hands on his hips, and told her, not unkindly, that she could save everyone trouble by giving the office what it wanted before the sweep made it formal. There's a list going around, Mrs., he said at the door. A petition like. Council rules say a standing exemption to a removal order can be granted for a named individual if family takes wardship. Marsh told you that, I expect. What she won't have told you is the same rules let the town contest it. Signatures. They're collecting them in the back of Varick's store like it's a raffle. He settled his cap. People sign things in the back of stores they'd be ashamed to say to your face. That's all the warning I've got in me. That was how the Solis family learned the shape of the fight. Not a mob with torches. The Hollow didn't have the honesty for torches. A petition. Cream paper, ruled lines, a string-tied pen, sitting on a barrel between the seed bins and the boot polish, under a hand-lettered sign that said, Concerned Households of Drey's Hollow, where you could put your name with a clear conscience between buying flour and complaining about the weather. Contesting signatures required, by council rule, a hearing before the exemption could stand or fall. The hearing was set by Marsh's office for the last day before the sweep. By the 23rd day, the word in the lanes was 40 names. By the 26th, it was 60. 60 households, Dario said quietly at the table, doing the arithmetic the way he did everything, twice. There aren't but 240 in the town rolls. 1 in 4 of our neighbors has walked into the back of that store on purpose. Then we'll go find the other 3 and 4, Marin said, with more iron than she felt. She did not have to go find the first one. The first one came to her, and he came on crutches. Toma Corliss had been the night watchman at the bonded warehouse on the North Quay for 11 years, right up until the nigh 2 winters back when a corner of the warehouse roof had come down in the great wet snow and taken the loading gantry with it, and Corliss's left leg, and this was the part everyone knew, the part that had been retold in every taproom on the shelf until it had smooth worn handles of furniture. The gutter ox had been there, inside the fence after dark, where it had no business and no right. And Corliss had been found at the gate with his arm broken in 3 places. And what more did anyone need to know about what the creature was? He stood in the shop doorway now, balancing on his crutches, an angular man gone gray early, and he looked at the boarded hole where her window had been, and his jaw worked. Heard about the glass, he said. Heard about the petition, too. My sister signed it. Showed me proud of herself. He moved a crutch tip on the floorboards, precise, agitated. Mrs. Solis. I've got a thing in my chest I've been carrying 2 winters, and it's gone too heavy this week. Can I put it down in your back room? And then you'll tell me what it's worth. Because I honestly don't know anymore. She closed the shop. She made tea he didn't drink. And Toma Corliss, watchman, put it down. Everyone knows the story, he said. Notice how nobody ever asked me to tell it. 2 winters. And not one soul has ever sat me down and said, Toma, what happened? Because the shape of it was so good. The beast inside the fence, the broken watchman at the gate, it tells itself. You don't ask a story like that any questions, you just pass it on. He stared at the stove door. The roof came down on the gantry at the second hour. I was under it, pinned across the legs by the main beam in the dark and the wet snow, with the rest of the stack settling over me. You could hear it deciding to come down. That's a sound I still get nights, and the watch bell out of my reach, and the quay empty till dawn. He came over the fence because I was screaming, Mrs. That's the business he had inside it. 11 years I walked that fence line, and I knew what slept in the flue across the way, same as everyone. I'd have told you the same things they all tell. And it came over a bonded fence, toward a man screaming, in the dark, where being found would cost it everything. It got the beam up off me. A beam I have seen 4 men fail to shift with a pole jack. It held the beam on its back. His voice went somewhere else for a moment, came back level, while the stack came down on the both of us. And it carried me out from under a falling warehouse roof. And the carry is when my arm got broke, because the gap we came through was the size it was, and it could be my arm in the gap or my skull under the stack. Anyone who's worked timber knows that arithmetic. It ran the numbers and it spent the arm. Right call, I'd shake on it today. The stove ticked. Marin found she had been holding her own forearm. At the gate, Corliss said, while we waited on the dawn shift, it kept my coat closed for me because my hands wouldn't. And it said one thing. It said when they come, I was never here. Because being a hero inside that fence was still being inside that fence, and it had 2 years of learning what this town does with any story that's got its shape in it. He looked up at last, and his eyes were wet and furious. And I let it have its wish, God forgive me. I was hurt and scared of losing the pension, and the foreman wrote the report his own way, and by the time my leg healed, the story had furniture in every tap room from here to Carthan, and what was I going to do? Walk in on crutches and take a beam off myself so? He sat back. 2 winters that thing has been the proof of every rotten word in this town mouth, and it has never once told anybody what it actually was that night, and the only reason I can think of is that nobody ever asked. Same as me. The hearing is in 8 days, Marin said quietly. What you just put down, can you pick it up one more time? In front of the council, in front of Marsh, in front of all of them? Corliss was silent for a long moment. My sister signed that paper, he said. My pension comes through Pike's Harbor office, and don't think I haven't done that arithmetic too. Then he laughed, short and rough, at nothing she could see. He spent the arm, Mrs. Right call, and he made it in the dark in half a second, for a man who'd never given him a kind word. He took up his crutches. Yes, put me on your list. Some things are heavier carried than spent. Took me 2 winters to learn what that boy knew at the bottom of a falling roof. That night, for the first time, Marin went and stood beside Teo at the dark window, and looked at the lane with him. Toma Corliss came to the shop today, she said, and felt the stillness beside her change quality. He told me about the beam. He's going to tell the council. For a long time, nothing. The harbor light made its pass. His arm, Teo said at last, it healed crooked. I see it when he buys his tobacco. It catches when he reaches. The gravel was very low. I had his weight, and the gap was coming, and I chose his arm without asking him. I think about it when I see him reach. A pause. Will the council punish him for the fence? And there it was, Marin thought. 8 days from a hearing that would decide whether he hauled mud for Pike until his plates went driftwood. And the question he had, the only question, was whether the man whose life he'd bought would be docked for it. No, she said. Nobody's punishing anyone for that night. Not anymore. He took that in then, with enormous care, as if setting down something explosive. When he tells it. Will they ask me things? His eyes didn't leave the lane. I have never said words in a room of humans. More than 3. My voice. The plates shifted. They feel it in the floor, and their faces change. I've watched it. I make rooms wrong, Marin. It was the first time he had ever said her name. She'd noticed him constructing whole sentences sideways for weeks to avoid it, as if her name were the kettle, as if it needed permission. Then we'll be the room, she said. All 3 of us in the front row. Look at us, and let the rest of them feel the floor. Marsh came up Brindle Lane herself on the 28th day with 1 clerk and a militia corporal, and a flat case the size of a Bible. A condition of the pending exemption hearing, she said in the kitchen, declining the chair and the tea with the same economical nod. Subject remains at liberty in the interim within town bounds on a registered tether. She opened the case. Inside, in a fitted recess, lay a band of dull alloy as wide as Marin's 2 hands, hinged with a sealed gray module at the clasp, worn at the ankle. It reads position against the militia beacons. If the subject leaves town bounds or enters the bonded quay, or is unaccounted for between the night bells, the exemption is forfeit and removal is immediate, hearing or none. The alternative is interim custody at transit holding until the hearing date. She looked up. Most families, I find, prefer the tether. He has a name, Pia said from the doorway before either parent could speak. It's Teo. It means, she scowled, retrieving it. Third thaw, Omases told me. Because he was born when the ice went out the third time. Marsh regarded the 6-year-old for a moment. Something moved behind the procedural face, quickly filed. Most families prefer the tether, she said again to the adults and set the case on the table. Teo wore it. He carried the band to Marsh's clerk and held his own ankle out for it. Steady, while the clerk's hands shook on the clasp, and Marin, watching, understood that he had been measured for things before. That somewhere between the grain hauler and the boiler house flu, this exact transaction, his body, and an official's instrument, had happened in some form already, and he decided long ago that flinching cost extra. 41 grams, he said that evening, conversationally, to Pia, who had demanded to inspect it. Lighter than your school boots. Does it hurt? No. He rotated his ankle so the module caught the lamplight gravely, a museum exhibit. It only tells them where I am. That's dumb, said Pia. Everyone always knows where you are. You're enormous. And he laughed. The first time in 38 days under their roof. A low seismic stutter. Gravel shaken in a pan, so unmistakably a child's giggle built in the wrong size of body that Dario put down his ledger and Marin had to turn to the stove and grip the rail, and Pia, with the satisfaction of a safecracker hearing tumblers fall, immediately set about making it happen again. 2 days later, somebody tried to make him a thief. It was done well. She had to grant the craft of it, even as she stood shaking with rage in her own stockroom. A militia search, warranted, dawn time for maximum audience on the lane, acting on information received. And there behind the shop's water barrels, wrapped in sacking that was not her sacking, lay a bonded cargo seal press from Pike's own harbor office, reported missing 2 days prior. A thing of brass and lead worth half a year of anyone's wages. A thing whose theft was not a misdemeanor but a removal-grade felony for any Xeno hand that had touched it. The corporal in charge, the same man who had taken her statement over the broken window, and who had grown, Marin judged, very tired of certain errands, turned the seal press over without enthusiasm. Information received, he repeated when she demanded it. Anonymous, Mrs. They always are. Then receive some information from me, Marin said, loud enough for the gathered lane to have no trouble with it. My stockroom takes deliveries from the alley. The alley gate's lock was filed and oiled. There you can see the bright work. Your own thumb is on it. We sleep 4 in this house, and one of us doesn't ever, by more than an hour at a stretch, and he sleeps facing the street. She pointed at the sacking. And whoever wrapped that brought their own cloth, because they knew better than to be in my stockroom long enough to look for mine. Your information received walked in through a lock they'd prepared earlier, Corporal. Ask Pike's office, who had access to a seal press that's been missing 2 days and a reason to spend it on us. It might have ended there, in the usual fog, except for the tether. Marsh's clerk, summoned because any felony implicating the subject voided the exemption automatically, arrived self-important and left differently because the tether's beacon log, read out in front of 9 witnesses, showed the subject stationary in the back room of the Solis house from final bell to first bell every night, including both nights since the seal press vanished. The instrument that had been fastened on him as a leash had functioned on its second day as his alibi. 41 grams, Teo said that night, at the window, and Marin heard under all that gravel something she had never heard in him before. Amusement, with teeth in it. But it was Varick who turned the lane. The dry goods man came out of his store while the militia were still packing their warrant satchel, and he stood in the middle of Brindle Lane in his apron, and he was holding the petition. Everyone there knew the cream paper by sight. It had its own celebrity by now. 84 names, the lane said. 84 households, the raffle of the righteous, and Varick its proud teller, Varick who had sworn on market day to put the brute on the list himself. He looked at the seal press going into its evidence box. He looked at the filed lock on the alley gate, at the sacking that was nobody's sacking, at the corporal's weary face. He had been a teller of other things in his time, Marin would think later. A man who weighed and bagged for a living, developed, whatever else was wrong with him, an honest hand for what things actually came to. I saw the riot, Varick said, not to her, to the lane, to the windows, to the general air, in the voice he used for calling waits. I was 4 feet from it. I've told it since like the Xeno was the riot, because that's how it sat in my eye. It's so big. You look at the picture, and it's the only thing in it. His jaw worked. But I waited out last night, Mrs., on account of my boy bragging what he said to your girl, and her hitting him, and him not being able to tell me when I pressed him one thing the creature ever did to him. One thing. And I'm standing here watching grown men try to file a child into a felony, and I find he held up the petition, and his voice went hard. I find I don't care for the company my name is keeping. He tore his own signature off the top of the first page. Just his, a careful strip, leaving 83, folded the strip, and put it in his apron pocket like a receipt for something. Then he went back inside his store and began, with violence, to rearrange the window display. It was not a conversion. He never said a kind word about Teo that day or after. But the lane had watched the petition's own teller tear a strip off it, and by evening the story had been to the harbor and back twice, growing each way, and the raffle in the back of the store was quietly moved and then was quietly nowhere at all, and the 83 names stopped being a thing people mentioned with their chests out, and started being a thing people hoped wouldn't be read aloud, anywhere their mothers could hear. Harrow's answer to all of it arrived on the 33rd day, in the person of Harrow himself. He came to the shop at closing, alone, which was its own message. A narrow man in a good coat, with the bland, unfinished face of a clerk and the stillest hands Marin had ever seen on a human being. He bought a tin of stove black. He counted out the coins exactly. And then he stood holding his purchase and said, in a voice like dry paper, "You've cost me a wall, Mistress Solis." "Walls fall," she said. "Buy your stove black somewhere else." 2 years I kept that creature fed through winters that killed harder things, and the town let me, because the town wanted it managed and I was willing to manage it. You want to call that buying a child? I've heard the words going around. The still hands turned the tin once. Here's what the word leaves out. The night sweeps would have taken it in its first month. Pike's recruiters had its shoulders priced before it learned the harbor's name. I marked it, and the mark meant mine, and mine meant every other wolf on the shelf walked past it for 2 years. You've unmade that with soup and a cot, and the hearings in 3 days, and whatever those council mice decide, you'd best understand what you've done. He set the tin down on the counter, unopened, leaving it. You've taken the mark off, missus. Everything that walks past your gate from now on walks past it because it chooses to. I'd lock up early. The row remembers what it's owed, and there's weather coming. He was at the door when Marin found the thing she actually wanted to say, and it came out with no heat at all, flat, like reading back his own ledger to him. He was 4 days off the boat and 3 days starved, and you fed him once and called him yours for 2 years of cart hauling and door standing. I've fed him 33 days straight, and you know what he's called mine? Nothing. Not one thing. He asks permission to touch the kettle, because every adult he's ever met has been some species of you. She came around the counter and opened the door for him, courteous as a duelist. There's no mark on him, Harrow, there never was. There was just a child deciding every morning that your meal was the best deal on a street where nobody else offered one. He's had a better offer. That's the whole of what happened, and the reason it frightens you is that you can't undercut it, because the price of what we charge is nothing, and what we pay is everything, and your books don't have a column for either. For the unfinished face did something, a flicker around the eyes, the look of a man finding an error in an account he'd trusted for years, and deciding very quickly to have not seen it. Weather coming, Harrow said again softly, and went out into the dusk. She told Dario all of it, and most of it to Teo, and the part about weather to neither of them, because it had sounded in the moment like a threat about rain. It was 3 more days before she learned that on the row, weather coming meant exactly what it said, and that Harrow, whatever ledger he kept where his soul should have been, had stood in her doorway, taken her measure, and paid her, in the only currency he had, the single honest warning of his professional life. The storm made landfall on the night before the hearing. They had known it was coming the way the shelf always knew, by the upcountry going green-black at noon, and the harbor birds vanishing inland and Oma, down at the 3rd pier, hoisting the double cone on the tide mast for the first time in 6 years. By dark the rain came in horizontal, and the tide came in wrong, over the back of the ebb, the river running upstream of itself, the whole black weight of the estuary leaning on the long berm like a shoulder against a door. The Solis house was high ground, 3rd Street up from the Lowfield. They banked the stove, shuttered what had shutters, and sat in the lamplight listening to the world being struck repeatedly with the flat of the sky's hand. Pia fell asleep against Teo's plated arm at the kitchen table, mid-sentence, in the middle of explaining her hearing testimony, which she had been composing aloud for 3 days, and which began with the words, "Honored counsel, you are all wrong about everything." At the second night bell, Teo's head came up. Marin had been watching the candle. She missed the first second of it, and so what she saw was the end of the motion. The great gray skull lifted, angled north-northeast, the amber eyes wide open and fixed on the shuttered wall as if the wall were not there.
Stone still.
Listening with his whole body, the way he listened down through floors. "Teo, the berm," he said. Something's wrong with the water inside it. Dario was already moving for his boots. Inside it, the sluice. The word came out of him strange and slow, and Marin understood that he was translating, not from Vurok, from something under language, from 2 years of sleeping against brick that carried every sound the harbor made into his bones. The relief sluice on the Lowfield cut. It sings when it spills, iron, falling water, every storm, all night, you can feel it from the row. It's not singing. He stood, and the table jumped, and he didn't notice, and that, more than anything, put the cold through her. The gates are shut. The storm tide is coming over the back of the ebb, and the relief gates are shut, and the water has nowhere to go but up the inside of the berm. The amber eyes came around to Marin, and they were a child's eyes in a Vault's face, asking her the way he asked about the kettle. The Lowfield School, the annex by the cut. Is that where they put people when the water comes? Tell me that's not where they put them. Outside, far down the dark, the hollow storm bell began to ring the pattern every child on the shelf learned before their letters. 3 and 3 and 3. Lowfield, rising water, get to the annex. The tether was the first thing Marin thought of, and she hated herself for the thought even as it finished forming. Town bounds ran to the inside toe of the long berm. The Lowfield cut, the sluice, the annex. All of it sat in the flood reach beyond the third beacon, and the band on his ankle did not know what a storm was. If the subject leaves town bounds, the exemption is forfeit, and removal is immediate, hearing or none. He was already at the door, Dario's biggest storm coat in one hand, and he stopped, one hand on the latch, and she watched him do the same arithmetic. 41 grams. 11 hours to the hearing. Everything, the room, the cot, the kettle, he had finally stopped asking about. The small one's weight asleep against his arm 30 seconds ago. The first place in the living memory of his body where someone had told him which side of the door he could sleep on and meant come in. All of it on one side of the scale, and the storm bell on the other, ringing 3 and 3 and 3. It was no contest at all. That was the thing she would tell the council in the morning, the thing she would tell the whole soaked and shame-faced town. It was never, for 1 second, a contest, and the fact that every adult in that room would have had to think about was the difference between them and the child they'd been frightened of. Teo, she said. He looked back at her, braced for her to be the one who said stay, who said the hearing, who said be worth removing tomorrow. She grabbed Dario's storm lantern off its peg and lit it on the second strike. The militia beacons logged the band, and I log you. Wherever you go tonight, I go behind you witnessing. Let them read that in the morning. Dario was lacing his boots with his jaw set. Take her up to Hannum's. Old Foreman Hannum, highest house on the lane, bad knees, iron stove, a door that had slammed on them since the riot. There was no time to pick a better ally, and no better ally to pick. Marin got her sleeping daughter up and into Dario's arms, and at the gate in the screaming rain, her husband caught her once by the back of the neck. Forehead to forehead, half a second. 20 years of conversation conducted in no words at all, and then he ran uphill, and she ran down, after the wall. She had never seen Teo move at full intent. No one in the hollow had. That was, she understood now, the entire principle of his life. Be useful, be silent, be elsewhere, and above all, be slow, because the day they see what you can do is the day their fear gets proof. He went down the drowned lanes ahead of her at a pace she could not have matched on a dry track in daylight, and he did it carrying the storm lantern she'd shoved into his hand, holding it backward over his shoulder, lighting her way and not his own. The Lowfield was already going under when they came off the last street. Not deep, ankle deep, shin deep, a black sheet crawling up out of the cut with a speed that read wrong to the eye, water with intent. But it was everywhere, and under the storm's roar there was a sound Marin had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. The deep belly groan of saturated earth, the long berm talking to itself in the dark. The annex sat on its low rise beside the cut, lamplit, sandbagged to the second course, the storm refuge it had been for 40 years. Because the Lowfield always flooded streetside first, and the rise had always been the dry place, the gathering place, the place you sent your children while you fought the water out of your parlor. Marin could see shapes moving against its windows. Lots of shapes. Small ones. The berm always held, she said out loud stupidly to the rain, 40 years of always. Everyone in those windows was in that building because of always. Teo wasn't looking at the annex. He was looking at the cut, the deep stone channel that ran from the sluice gates through the Lowfield to the harbor, the berm's relief vein, which should have been a torrent tonight, and was instead running half-empty, sullen, backward. He went down its bank to the sluice house at a dead run with the water exploding away from his strides, and Marin came slipping and gasping behind. And so the two of them together were the first to see it, by storm lantern light, what had been done to the gates. The sluice house had been opened with keys. No splintered hasp, no forced door. Keys, and inside, the great screw stands that raised the twin relief gates stood naked and amputated. The bronze worm gears were gone, both of them. Cut free with a hacksaw's patience, leaving bright raw stubs, and without them the gates were half a ton of dead iron in their grooves, locked shut against the rising water with no mechanism left in the world to lift them. Bronze, Marin thought, numb. 200 weight of harbor bronze a gear, and Harrow's crews moved metal through the crook market every week of their lives. And there's weather coming, he'd said. The row remembers what it's owed, and then, on the heels of it, colder, keys. Harrow's men had keys to Pike's sluice house. Somebody had sold the Hollow's whole low field for scrap value and a grudge, and somebody else had unlocked the door for them. And tomorrow the dredge contractor would survey the ruin of the berm he had spent the autumn, calling obsolete, and the council would give him everything he asked. "Can you lift the gates?" she shouted over the storm. Bare, without the gears, from above, with purchase. He was reading the screw stands, the grooves, the gate heads, fast, the way he'd read the riot crowd for the spaces nobody knew they had. It would take time. And the water, his head snapped around north, up the line of the berm, a heartbeat before Marin heard it too. A new sound under the groan. A seam of sound, tearing. The berm did not break where anyone would have chosen. It broke 100 yards above the annex rise. Where Pike's autumn survey cut, the exploratory trench his crews had dug into the landward toe and backfilled loose, the corner he had cut to price the winter contract, had been drinking stormwater all night like a wick. The crest slumped, the slump opened, and the estuary came through the gap not as a wave but as a widening, a black muscle of water thickening from nothing to a mill race in the time it took Marin to scream. The flood took the low field in earnest then, and the annex rise, the dry place, the always place, became in 90 seconds an island, with the cut on one side, the new race on the other, and 14 children and 2 teachers inside a lamplit building watching the water climb the sandbags. There was one way off the island that did not involve swimming a mill race in the dark. The cut had a footbridge, a stone-piered, timber-decked span 60 years old that crossed from the annex rise to the High Street stairs. It stood upstream of the breach's main pull, and it was the obvious road, the only road, and as Marin and Teo came back up the bank toward it, the storm lanterns showed them what the flood had already done to it. The upstream pier had been undermined. The whole middle of the span had dropped a hand's width and torqued. Deck planks sprung and gapped, and the water was over its midpoint and shoving, and the bridge was making a sound like a ship's rigging in a gale. 60 years of trust being asked, all at once, the question it could not answer all night. Figures were converging on the far stairhead with lanterns, the high street waking, the bell roused, militiamen and neighbors with ropes coming down to the stair and stopping dead at the sight of the span. And from the annex side, the first teacher was already out on the bridge with a child on her hip and another by the hand, because the water was at the sandbag's last course, and what choice in this world did she have? And the deck lurched under her, and her scream came down the wind, and she froze at the span's edge, one child gripping her coat, 10 feet of groaning timber between her and everyone alive who could help. Marin never gave the order. There was no order to give and no one to take it. There was only the wall going past her. Teo went down the bank and into the cut upstream of the bridge. Into it, chest deep, where the water hit him like cargo and the cold made his plates ring, and he got under the span at its broken middle, boots biting into the drowned rubble of the failed pier, and he stood up. The bridge came up with him, not all the way. A hand's width, the lost hand's width, timber screaming, the torqued deck pulling level, and then the whole sprung. Dying span settled onto his shoulders and his upraised arms and stayed there, and the groan of it changed pitch and stopped. The rigging sound stopped. 60 tons of flood was leaning on the cut, and a child of the Varrock stood under the broken heart of the bridge and held it. Still, now, he roared, and the night had never heard his voice unbottled. It went through the storm like a bell through fog. It shook water off the deck planks, and every lantern on both banks swung toward the bridge at once. Small ones first. 1 big, 4 small. Keep walking, don't stop on the middle, I have it. For 1 long second, nothing moved. 14 days the town had been told what stood in the water. 2 years it had crossed streets to avoid him, signed papers against him, thrown its bricks and filed its lies, and Marin stood on the bank with her heart slamming and watched the whole rotten ledger of Drey's Hollow hang, in the storm air between a frozen teacher and the monster of Saltern Row, holding out the only road home on his own back. It was the child on the teacher's hip who broke it, 6 years old, maybe less, peering down over the rail into the dark at the great plated head and the amber eyes, and recognizing him with the Hollow's own nursery dread and recalculating it, all in one breath, the way only the very young can. It's the big one, delighted, imperious, slapping the teacher's shoulder. Go, the big one's got it! The teacher went. The bridge under her did not so much as shiver, because the thing beneath it had decided it would not, and her boots hit the high street stairs, and living hands took the children off her, and a sound came off both banks that was half sob and half cheer, and then the relay began. Maren crossed the other way, against the line onto the island, because the annex still had to be emptied in order, and somebody had to count. And she was the shopkeeping woman who had counted stock through 9 winters, and she knew her use when she saw it. The second teacher had the children mustered in the doorway, oldest carrying youngest, and Maren took station at the bridgehead and ran the tally and fed them on. One big for small, lantern light on small soaked faces. The Cooper's twins. The Varick boy who went past her wordless with his little cousin in a knot on his back. A girl who stopped dead in the middle of the span, looked straight down through the sprung planks at Teo and said, "Don't drop us," and got back. From underneath the bridge, from under 60 tons, in a gravel suddenly gentle enough for a sick room. Never, and walked on, below them all, hip-braced in black water that was still rising, the wall stood. Maren, counting heads in the rain, could spare him only seconds at a time, and every glance cost her. The water had gone from his chest to his shoulder's base. The cold was in his voice now, and the flood was bringing him the berm's wreckage piece by piece. Fence posts, a stock trough, half a shed roof spinning down the race to slam into him and break apart and be ridden down under his boots. He took it all and did not move, and between blows he talked. That was the thing nobody who survived that bridge ever managed to leave out of the telling in all the years after. The monster talked the whole time, low and steady, in time with small footsteps overhead. Walk on, you're heavier than the water, little one. I have it, walk on, 11 across, 12 the teachers. Maren sent the last pair. The second teacher with the smallest child wrapped inside her coat, and stood alone at the bridgehead of a drowning island and turned for her own crossing, and that was when the night, which had taken so much already, reached for one thing more. Upstream, where the race ran hardest through the breach, a lantern was waving. Wrong side, low to the water, on the roof ridge of the drowned sluice house, and screaming with it, 2 voices, ragged, going under the storm and surfacing again. Maren's own lantern found them at the same moment Teo's head turned. 2 men clinging to the ridge with the flood at their belts, and even at 80 yards, even through the rain, she knew the wiry shape of the first one. Both hook Scar, Harrow's man. The crew that had cut the gears had been caught by their own harvest, and the race they had opened was eating the roof out from under them, a course of brick at a time. The far bank had seen them too. She heard the shouts, saw a rope come down the stair and stop, and the men holding it stop, because there was no throw on the shelf that reached 80 yards upstream through a mill race, and no boat alive in that water, and everyone on both banks did the arithmetic at the same time and arrived at the same cold sum. No road to them, none, except down the cut itself, through the worst of it, by something heavy enough to wade where water broke ships. The bridge was empty now, only Maren left to cross. Teo looked up at her through the sprung planks, rain hammering off his skull plates, the question in the amber eyes as plain as if he'd shouted it, and it was not "may I." It was never "may I." It was the other one, the one he'd asked at the boiler house with frost in his joints, the one nobody before her had ever answered right. "Which side do I guard?" "Cross me over," Maren shouted down through the storm, "and go get them." He crossed her over. Not by the bridge. The moment his shoulders left it, the span would be back on its drowned pier in its own luck, and they both knew without saying it that the bridge's luck was spent. He took her down off the bridgehead with one arm, held her against the plates of his chest above the water. She felt absurdly, like the crate on the shop counter, like a thing being set down softly, and he waded the cut below the span, 4 strides through water that would have erased her, and put her onto the high street stair into a dozen reaching hands. "Rope," he said to the militiaman at the stair foot, and such was the night, such was the bridge still standing behind him, that 3 coils were in his hands before anyone remembered they were arming the gutter ox. He ran one end through the stair's iron mooring ring, took the coils over his shoulder, and went back into the race. Upstream, against a current that had broken the long berm in the dark with the storm on his back, Maren stood on the 3rd step with the water sucking at her boots and watched the lantern light lose him and find him and lose him, a gray island. That walked, breasting it, leaning into the flood at an angle no living thing should have held, and the whole stairhead crowd silent now. Every lantern raised, 3 dozen humans of Drey's Hollow watching the creature from the removal list weighed out to spend itself on the men who had drowned the Lowfield. He reached the sluice house as the ridge course went. Maren heard the masonry let go even over the storm, and then the wiry man's scream, cut short not by water but by a gray hand closing on his collar, holding him and his half-sunk partner both up out of the race against the last standing gable while, one-armed, Teo made the rope fast around the chimney's root. The crowd on the stairs hauled the line taut to the mooring ring, and down that sagging, thrumming road, through the worst water on the shelf, the monster of Saltern Row carried home the two men who had been sent, 3 weeks before, to tell a shopkeeper that everything she owned was a thing that breaks. He came up the stair with one over each shoulder, set them down on the cobbles with the same exact care he gave the kettle, the crate, the scarf, and stood swaying. That was the first moment Marin truly saw the price. Lantern light is honest light. The plates of his chest and shoulders, brick gray and seamless every day of the week she'd known him, were crazed all over with fine, pale lines, like river ice the day before it goes. A long crack ran the width of his back where the shed roof had struck, weeping slow dark resin into the rain. And when he turned to find her face in the crowd, searching for it, only it, his legs went, and the night's whole audience of Drey's Hollow surged forward and caught him. Or tried. Half a ton of child sat down on the high street stairs regardless, gently, like a cargo crane settling, and what the crowd actually accomplished was to be touching him when he did it. 20 hands on the cooling plates, on the cracked back, the harbor master's wife with her shawl already off and utterly inadequate to the acreage of him, old Hannum's daughter shouting up the street for the horse blankets, somebody's grandfather working his coat under the great skull, the town of Drey, Hollow, which had crossed streets for 2 years, discovering all at once and forever how it actually felt to touch him, which was like touching a foundered draft animal, or a fallen roof beam, or any other thing in this world that had been holding up more than its share for longer than anyone had bothered to ask. The small ones, Teo said. His gravel had gone slow and slurred, the cold deep in it. The amber eyes were guttering. Count, 14. There were 14. Count them again. 14, Marin said, her hands on his face, her forehead against the wet plate of his brow, heedless, fierce. 14 across 2 teachers, all counted, all warm, all because of you, do you hear me? Now you do the next thing, Teo, the hard thing. You let go of the bridge. It's over, and you can let go now. Somebody else is holding tonight. The eyes found her, dim amber, a child's, asking. Which started? The old question? The only question. And Marin Solis broke once and completely in front of her whole town, and held the great cracked head against her shoulder, and gave him the answer she should have given at the boiler house. No sides anymore. Sleep in the middle. Everyone's watching the lane tonight. The amber eyes went out like bank coals, trusting her exactly that fast, and the monster of Drey's Hollow slept on the high street stairs in the rain under 19 blankets and his town's hands. Dawn came up gray and shamefaced over a drowned lowfield, a broken berm, a standing bridge, and not one human body lost. The reckoning, when it came fast. Disaster does honest bookkeeping. The militia took the wiry man's statement before his lungs were dry, and he gave Harrow up in whole paragraphs, because the Row's first law had always been that loyalty ran exactly as deep as the pay, and what payment was there in the world for the night he'd just had? The crew had been promised the bronze and a fee. The keys had come through a chain with one end in the crook market, and the other end, said the wiry man, lifting his face with the spite of the freshly drowned, in the harbor office that held the sluicehouse master ring. Pike's office. Sign the log out. File no copy. Ask no questions. Same office, he added, that had loaned out a bonded seal press a month back and reported it missing 2 days late. The militia found both worm gears before noon, sawn and crated in a crook market lockup, with Harrow's freight mark stenciled on the slats. Harrow himself was gone off the shelf on the dawn packet, traveling light, leaving stock, ledgers, and crew to the weather, a man who had read his own column of figures at last and folded the business. And Dario Solis, mud to the hips, walked Marsh's clerks and 2 councilmen up the wreck berm to the breach, and stood them in front of the failed backfill of Pike's autumn survey trench, and then handed them the cooperative's drainage records and Toma Corliss's 11 years of night watch logs, which together documented, in 2 stubborn, careful hands, every cut corner along that earthwork since the dredge contract changed hands, soundings filed without being taken, fill drawn from the cheap pits, the trench dug against the council's own engineer's note, and backfilled in a week of rain. The berm had not failed. The berm had been spent by a man pricing a winter contract, and the storm had simply presented the bill. They arrested Garen Pike at the assay house at the 2nd hour past dawn, in front of the posted removal order with his own tender language in it, and the crowd that watched him let out did it in a silence that had teeth. Marin missed all of it. She spent the morning in her own kitchen, where 6 of Omases's dockhands had carried Teo on a cargo door borrowed from the 3rd pier, and where the old Vurok herself sat working a heated dressing of harbor pitch and wax along the crack in his back while he slept and the stove roared. And Pia stood guard at the door of the back room with a wooden spoon in her belt like a sidearm, informing all comers, and there were comers now, the lane suddenly full of soup and firewood and folded blankets and neighbors who could not meet Marin's eyes and came anyway, that he was sleeping, that he was not to be poked, and that visitors could leave their offerings with her, the doorkeeper, and state their business. The plates will seal, Omases said, quietly working. He's young, they'll seal smooth, younger than this town will ever let itself believe. The pale eyes lifted to Marin's. I have tallied tides on this harbor 30 years, human, and I will tell you the strangest one I ever logged. Last night the water rose, and this town's children were carried over it by the one creature in the hollow that every door had been shut against. And this morning the tide turned, and now it is soup as far as I can see. The driftwood plates shifted, the long, slow Vurak laugh. Your sweep is in 2 days, your hearing is in 4 hours, and half the council was on those stairs last night in their nightshirts, watching him hold their grandchildren's bridge up out of the flood. Go and wash your face, doorkeeper. I will mind the lane. I believe you have an appointment to keep. The hearing was held at noon in the Assay House Hall because the council chamber on the Lowfield side was under 3 feet of river. They had to prop the doors and open the gallery, and still the hall could not seat the hollow that came soaked and sleepless and smelling of mud and lamp oil, came on crutches and in militia coats, came carrying children who had crossed a bridge in the night and would not now be left at home by any power short of chains. Etta Marsh sat at the clerk's table with the file, the forms, and the tether log, and her face was the same procedural weather it had always been, and her strong box of stamps sat closed. The subject of the proceedings was not present. The subject of the proceedings was asleep under 19 blankets, on a workshop cot, with a wooden spoon sentry at his door, and the council, advised by the militia surgeon and a Vurak elder that moving him would be both cruel and impossible, had agreed for the first time in the matter's history that the proceedings could wait on the comfort of a Xeno child. Small winds, Dario murmured. Run in herds. Marin stood when her name was called. She had not slept, and her hands were burned raw from rope, and somewhere in the night she had stopped being afraid of any room on Meridian Shelf. You have the petition in front of you, she said. 83 names against my family's wardship of a Vurak miner, name of Teo, called by this town the gutter ox, the brute of Saltern Row, the monster of Drey's Hollow. Her voice was even. I'm not here to argue with 83 frightened signatures. The night already did. I'm here to read the other ledger. She lifted Corliss's logbook. The watchman beside her came up onto his crutches. 2 winters back, Marin said, a warehouse roof came down on the North Quay, and the Hollow heard the beam story at last, heard it from Corliss himself, in the same flat, careful voice he'd used in her back room. My arm in the gap or my skull under the stack. He ran the numbers, and he spent the arm, and the hall was so quiet underneath it that Marin could hear the gallery floor creak with leaning. She watched the story land on row after row of faces that had passed it around for 2 years with furniture in it, and watched it become what it had always been, a child going over a fence towards screaming alone. The militia corporal testified to the seal press, the filed lock, the sacking, the beacon log. The teacher testified to the bridge, and could not finish, and finished anyway. The wiry man's deposition was read into the record by a clerk whose voice frayed on, walked past it for 2 years. Varick stood up unasked, said 5 sentences nobody had paid him for, and sat down again with his jaw shut. Omases, called as species witness, came to the rail in her tide tally coat, put her name to sponsorship in full hearing. Let it be refused out loud, she said mildly. I am told that is the custom here, and nobody refused. Then Marsh rose, and the hall braced. The file was in her hands, the classification, the order, the tender. The machine that had been rolling toward the row since market day, all of it lived in that file, and procedure, Marin knew by now, did not weep at bridges. The removal order names unplaced xenominers, Etta Marsh said to the council in her dry Carthan voice. I have audited the placements available under the council's contract. The contractor is in militia custody as of this morning, charged with negligent breach of a flood defense, falsification of survey records, and conspiracy in the theft of municipal works, the same works whose failure his tender was written to profit from. There is, as of this morning, no labor fosterage placement on Meridian Shelf that this office would certify for a dog. She closed the file. As for the miner in question, he has a sponsor of standing, a family of record, 11 hours of beacon log establishing residence, and the faintest pause, the sound of a winch choosing its words, character, and a town that appears to have rediscovered its arithmetic. The classification of unplaced cannot survive the facts. The office withdraws its objection to the exemption and recommends to the provincial seat that the removal order itself be vacated as procured under a corrupted tender. The remaining 10 miners of Saltern Row will be assessed individually, with the species elder present, for placement here, in this town, which has been shown what its children look like, crossing a bridge, and can decide for itself what it owes the ones who still sleep in the flues. She sat down and squared her forms, and Drey's Hollow's assay hall came apart, not into cheering. The night had been too long, and the mud too deep for cheering, but into something lower and better, a sound like the harbor at first tide, the sound of a town turning over. The council's vote was called 3 times by custom. There was no third call, there was no second. Wardship of the minor Teo, called third thaw, to the household of Marin and Dario Solis of Brindle Lane, granted, entered, sealed. And the exemption noted, in the clerk's careful hand, as unnecessary, the order it accepted him from having died on the same page. He slept through his own adoption and woke at dusk to find the tether gone. Marcia's clerk had come and unclasped it that afternoon, with 2 witnesses and a receipt procedure to the last. Teo lay still on the reinforced cot for a long time, looking at his own bare ankle in a manner Marin could not read, and then he asked, permission, of course always, whether he might keep the ban. Keep it? The clerk goggled. It's the instrument is office property. The log's been certified. The log, Teo said, slow, the cold still thick in his gravel. 11 hours. Where I went. What I was doing. The amber eyes came up. It's the first paper anyone ever made about me that I'd want read out. They let him keep it. In the end, decommissioned, the module dead, a 41-gram alloy ring. Pia threaded it onto a cord, and he wore it under his coat for years, the way other people wore medals or saints. And if anyone ever asked him what it was, he gave them the truth in 5 words, which was that it was an instrument that had been built to say where he was, and had ended up saying what he was, and that the difference between those 2 questions was the difference between the town before the storm and after. But the Hollow was not finished asking things of him, because Pike did not go quietly. The provincial tribunal convened at Carthen 6 weeks after the flood, negligent breach, falsified surveys, conspiracy in the gear theft, and Pike arrived, lawyered to the teeth, with an advocate who understood that the conspiracy charge hung on the testimony of drowned men from the crook market, easy to impeach, criminals clutching at a respectable name. The keys, the advocate would argue, were copied, the office log forged by clerks with grudges, the trench of sound work ruined by an unforeseeable storm. By the 2nd week of preparation, the provincial prosecutor came down to Drey's Hollow, personally sat in the Solis kitchen, and laid out the problem with his hands flat on the table. I can prove the berm was cut cheap. I cannot yet prove the sluice house. And the sluice house is the difference between negligence and the kind of verdict that makes the next contractor, on the next earthwork, think hard. The wiry man Dent, his name is, there's a thing I learned this month. The wiry man has a name. Dent's testimony puts the master keys in a harbor office envelope. The defense will eat Dent alive. But there is one witness on this shelf who can put the sluice house's silence into that courtroom, who heard, with his own body, the gates standing shut through a storm tide, who knew what it meant before any human alive, and whose hearing a Vurok elder will certify to the tribunal as an instrument finer than anything in the assay house. The prosecutor looked toward the back room. I'm told he has never spoken in a room of more than 3 humans. The tribunal hall seats 300. I won't pretend it's a small thing I'm asking. From the doorway, gravel unbottled, I'll come. He stood there filling the frame, and Marin watched him look down the barrel of the exact thing he had named at the dark window. I make rooms. Wrong, and not blink. One condition, Teo said. The 10 from the row. Pike's tender priced them by the shoulder. It's in the council minutes. I've heard it read. If I speak at Carthen, the record says why. I'm not testifying about water. He had grown, Marin realized, not in size and grammar. Whole paragraphs now, the words no longer laid down like bricks but flowing. 2 months of kitchen table talk compounding in him at a child's terrible rate. I'm testifying about what almost got bought. The hall at Carthen seated 300 and held 400, and when the species witness was called and the doors at the back swung, the entire chamber turned and did what rooms had always done, went wrong, went still, breathed in, and forgot the rest of it. Teo walked the long aisle slow, the way Oma Sess had coached him. Let them finish being afraid, little thaw. It is a tide. It goes out. And at the rail he did the thing not even Marin had known to expect. He knelt, folded himself joint by joint down to the level of the seated tribunal, the way he came down to Pia's level in the yard, until his amber eyes were even with the presiding judges. And the gesture said, in no language in all of them, I know what my body says in this room. Hear my voice instead. Then he put 2 years of nights into evidence. He testified to the song of the relief sluice through every storm of his life on the row, pitch and rhythm, iron and falling water, the exact hour it had always begun, the way it carried through brick and bone. He testified to its silence that night, and to the storm bell, and to the arithmetic a person did when the relief did not sing while the tide came over the back of the ebb. The advocate rose to challenge the witness's hearing, and the witness, kneeling, asked permission to demonstrate and told the courtroom. Accurately, the bailiffs confirmed it amid uproar. How many people stood in the corridor outside the sealed doors? Which of the 3 underclerks at the back table had a clock in his pocket running fast? and what note the building's cisterns sang 2 floors down. There were no further challenges to the witness's hearing. And when the advocate, salvaging, made the mistake of his career, you are, by your own account, a creature of the crook market's wharves. Why should this tribunal weigh the word of Harrow's marked ox over a respected contractor's? Teo did not look at the advocate. He looked at Pike, 2 months and a world away from the man who had priced shoulders at the assay. House door, and the gravel went down to bedrock, and the floor of the Hall of Carthan carried it to 400 pairs of feet. He never asked my word. None of them ever asked my word. Not when the warehouse fell, not when the bricks flew, not when his tender wrote me down as 200 weight of hall grade. Every man in this story made me a thing, and you can't lie to things, so they all let me hear everything. He turned back to the tribunal and finished, unhurried. That's the witness he built, your honors. I'm just the first room he's had to stand in where it could talk back. The verdict came in 9 days. Guilty on all heads, the tender voided, the surveymen struck off, and a provincial review opened into labor fosterage contracts on every earthwork on the shelf. The claws that had been waiting to swallow the Rose children dying not just in Drey's Hollow, but in 40 towns that had never heard Teo's name. Dent, the wiry man, drew a short term made shorter by testimony, the deciding character evidence, to the open disgust of the prosecutor and the visible confusion of Dent himself, came from the species witness, who said only that on the night of the flood the man had screamed for his partner before he screamed for himself, and that this was a column most ledgers didn't keep. The 10 of Saltern Row came in off the flues that same winter. Assessed individually, the elder present exactly as Marsh's recommendation had ordered. The Hollow took them the way the Hollow now did things, which was abashedly, stubbornly, and all the way. The Cooper's house took the kit-sized pair that had watched Marin from the wall with a bowhook, and Varick, to the perpetual astonishment of everyone including himself, took the eldest, the wire-thin watcher, who turned out to be called Senna, and to have a head for stock weights that made the dry goods man weep with avarice. The boiler house flue stood empty by midwinter. Pia led an expedition to confirm it and reported at dinner with proprietary satisfaction that the only thing left in the warm slot was a horn spoon, set upright in a crack of the brick, and that they had left it there, because that's the marker for the next one, and everyone knows it now, that's the rule. Mama made it up. Marin, who had made up no such rule, met Teo's eyes across the table and discovered that the rule existed anyway, had perhaps always existed, and was apparently hers. Winter turned. The berm rose again, rebuilt to the old engineer's spec under a new contract, with a council inspector on it daily and Dario's cooperative holding the drainage records in trust, and the heaviest single member of the work gang waiving his wage in a forward note to the council clerk that was framed, later, in the assay house. My streets too now. The shop bell rang 20 times before noon. The schoolhouse annex reopened on its island rise with a second bridge behind it, because the town had voted, without one speech, never again to give the water and its children only one road between them, and in the first soft week of spring, Teo began to molt. Omases had told them it would come, the first full molt, the boundary of Varrock childhood, plates lifting and shedding in slow weeks while the new armor cured beneath. He was sheepish about it, shedding flakes of gray on the workshop floor and sweeping them up himself, until the morning Pia found the big curved shoulder plate, the right one, come away whole in the night and propped against the cot like a dropped shield, and on it, pale and angular and dead, the brand. Harrow's mark, off him, not covered, not healed over, off in the way of his blood which did not erase what was written on it, but simply in time outgrew the page. He stood a long while looking down at it. Then he asked the kettle question. Marin saw it coming in the set of him, the small careful pause before permission, and stopped, straightened, asked nothing of anyone, and carried his old shoulder out through the kitchen, out the gate. His face had watched through a winter of nights, down Brindle Lane in the spring sun past every window to the harbor, and fed the mark to the tide. When he came back, Marin was at the gate. He stopped in front of her, new plate still pale at the seams, taller than the doorframe he no longer made wrong. It's gone, he said, and then, testing it, the way you test a bridge. Nothing on me says whose I am now. No, Marin said, nothing on you ever could. It was never going to be writing, Teo. It's the other kind. It's the kind you have to be told out loud for years until you believe it. Then keep telling me, said the monster of Drey's Hollow. Get inside, said his mother. Supper's on. Your sister set the table an hour ago, and if your stew's gone cold, you'll fold every scarf in this house.
There was one more test.
There is always one more. Moran had stopped expecting the world to round its numbers. It came in high summer, with the new berm green and the low field dry and the Hollow's memory just beginning to soften at the edges, the way even the best memory does. A man stepped off the Carthan packet with a leather folio and a manner like warmed oil, and spent 2 days moving through the town buying drinks and asking questions. And his questions all had the same shape under their differences. The Provincial Review had voided the old labor fosterage clause. Yes, terrible business. But the new framework allowed for apprenticeship contracts, properly certified, generously paid, and his principals operated deep bore works out past Etero where a young Vurok of exceptional frame could earn, in 3 years, what this charming little harbor town would not pay him in 30. He had heard, everyone on the shelf had heard, about the bridge. He had come, he said, with an offer. He made the mistake of opening the folio in Varick's store. Marin got the story from 4 directions before sundown, each telling prouder than the last. How Varick had read the contract's first page upside down across the counter, gone the color of his own brick, and sent his ward Senna out the back at a dead sprint, not to the militia, to the lanes. How the man with the folio had walked up Brindle Lane 20 minutes later to find his road simply filling. The cooper on his step, the harbor master's wife with her arms crossed, Hannum's daughter, Imber from the cooperative, the teacher from the annex with 30 children released early on the instant invention of a civic holiday, neighbor after neighbor stepping out of doors and falling in, nobody shouting, nobody touching him, the whole street just present, walking with him, escorting. Until by the time he reached the Solis Gate, the recruiter of the Etero Deep Bores arrived at the head of a silent parade of some 60 households of Drey's Hollow, every one of which had once signed, or nearly signed, or watched its friends sign, a petition on cream paper in the back of a store. Teo was in the yard splitting stovewood, Pia perched on the fence rail beside him doing her sums aloud. He took in the visitor, the folio, the street behind him. Marin watched her son read the crowd the way he'd once read a riot, for the spaces in it, and find none, and understand in real time what that meant. She watched it land in him, the plates of his back going loose by some degree no stranger would ever have measured. And then he set down the splitting maul and was, simply, polite. "You'll want my mother," he said. "Money is the house's. I only get a sweets allowance. I beg your pardon. The contract would be yours, of course. At your majority the law regards, sir." Gravel patient, a child explaining doors to a foreigner. "You're standing at the gate of the only thing, on any world I'd haul or to keep, asking me to leave it to be paid in what you think it's made of. Mother runs the shop. She'll tell you the price of things you can put in a folio." The amber eyes went briefly to the street, to the 60 silent households, and came back, and there was something in them very like the long, slow shift of Oma Sessa's plates. "And the rest of the price is behind you. Walk back slow and have a look at it." The recruiter walked back slow. The packet left at dawn lighter by 1 folio in the hollow, having discovered it could do this, filed the knowledge where towns keep such things, next to the storm bell. That night, past the 2nd bell, Marin rose for water and stopped in the hallway, because the workshop door stood open and the room had changed. The cot was against the east wall now. He had moved it that evening, asked Dario for help he did not need, a courtesy, 2 of them carrying it the way men do a thing together that one could do alone. And she hadn't seen the meaning until this minute, in the dark, with the harbor light making its slow pass. For 3 seasons the cot had stood under the window where he could sleep with his face, to the gate, to the lane, to the world's approaches. It stood now where the lane could not be seen at all. Teo lay asleep on his back, face to the ceiling, plates loose, one arm flung up over his head in the boneless, extravagant wastage of a sleeping child. And his back, his great scarred, resealed back, was to the door, to the house, to them. She stood in the hallway and understood what she was looking at, the last fortress giving itself up, the sentry off the wall, a creature that had spent its whole remembered life facing outward, asleep with its back to the only people in the universe, because somewhere below words, below even his own deep hearing, the arithmetic had finally closed. Nothing was coming up the lane that the house could not answer. He was not the wall anymore. He was what the wall had been for. On the floor beside the cot, in a tin tray, lay the things he kept. The dead tether on its cord. The horn spoon, the duplicate one, that Pia had insisted he have when the original was deeded to the flu. A flat harbor stone. And the red scarf, outgrown by Pia that spring and bequeathed to him with great ceremony, useless to his size, folded in quarters, corners squared. Marin stood a long time. Then she did what mothers do in doorways at night the world over, counted the breathing, learned nothing new, and was fed by it anyway. Market day came round with the year, and the square wore its bunting. Because the council in its wisdom had hung the harvest fair on the riot's anniversary. Take the date back, the proclamation said, which everyone understood and nobody said too loudly. The grain stalls stood where they had stood. The way station was new painted. The fountain had been repaired at last, and the burned smell was gone, and the hollow filled its square with itself. Stalls and noise and the smell of frying batter, Varick calling waits, Senna's quick wire shape darting the crowd with deliveries, Two of the Flu children selling pitch-sealed boat whistles off a barrow, Marsh, who had requested, to Carthan's bafflement, a permanent posting to the Hollow's little office, buying one with exact change. Marin worked their stall through the morning, Dario's seedlings and the shop's sundries, and watched her family move through the crowd that had once been a single frightened animal. Pia, 8 now, ran the square like a mare, and Teo, taller again this year, new plates gone the deep slate of young adulthood, the most recognized silhouette on Meridian Shelf, walked the stalls with a basket on his arm, and the crowd did not part for him. That was the whole miracle, and only Marin and perhaps Omacess knew to see it. No seam opened in the crowd along lines of fear. People bumped him, begged his pardon, called him by name. The awning man's successor waved him under the awning. Where there was no rain at all, a farmwife put a free pair in his basket because, she announced to her neighbor at volume, he'd carried her niece over the bridge, as if there were a soul in the square who did not know about the bridge. A toddler escaped its mother, attached itself to his leg, and was returned, solemnly, by one enormous careful hand, with the bow he had learned from a tribunal. The Hollow had not stopped seeing his size. It had finally finished the sentence, so big and so gentle, the whole of him at last in one ledger, with nothing carried in the margins. At noon, Marin left the stall to Dario and walked the square's edge with her son, sharing the pair, and they came without planning it to the place by the old fountain. Neither said anything for a while. The crowd roared gently around them, the way crowds do when they are only what they seem. Here, Teo said at last. Not a question. There, Marin said. She was about where the chestnut cart is. The brick came from past the fountain. And you came from. She found she did not actually know after everything and looked up at him. Where did you come from that morning? The fish stalls. I was under the gutting tables, waiting for the scraps to be thrown down. He said it without weight, an item of geography. I'd been watching the crowd go wrong for an hour. You can hear a riot deciding. It's like the warehouse stack, a sound of things choosing to fall. I'd already picked my way out. Over the harbor rail the way I went. He was quiet a moment. Then the small one's hand came out of her mother's. And the brick went up, and the plates moved, the old shrug, 3 seasons of words, and he still reached for it when the words were too big. I didn't decide, Marin. That's what I never told the hearing, or the tribunal, or anyone. Everyone says he chose to shield the child, he chose the bridge, he chose the men on the roof. I never once chose. I was moving before I knew. It's the only thing my body has ever done without asking anyone's permission, including mine. The amber eyes came down to her, and in the middle of the bright, loud square the question arrived. The last one, the one under all the others all along. What if it's just what I'm built for? The town used to say it about the breaking. What if they were only wrong about which thing? Marin finished the pair and gave the core to a passing goat with a Fair Day ribbon on it and took her time because the answer mattered and because she'd been carrying it ready for 3 seasons, waiting for the question to be asked out loud. The morning of the riot, she said, 1,000 people heard that brick go up. 2 of us moved. I was one and you were the other, and the difference between us was that I moved for my own blood and you moved for a stranger's. Whatever's built into a body that does that, Teo, it isn't Vurok and it isn't human, because most of both stood still. It's rarer than either, and every town on every world runs on the handful who have it, and almost every one of those towns makes your same mistake about where it lives. She looked up at him, her hulking son, her gentlest child, the best thing fear ever brought up her lane, folded backward into a family. You weren't built for breaking or for shielding. You were built the way everything worth keeping is built, bigger than the people measuring it. The rest was never in the plates. It was always in the part of you that folded the scarf. Nobody marked that. Nobody made it. It walked up Brindle Lane on its own, in the dark past 40 houses that hated it, to give a little girl back something she loved. That's not a build, son. That's a soul, and it's yours. And now everybody knows your name to ask before they wonder. The square went on roaring gently. The chestnut cart sent up its sweet smoke, where a brick had once gone up instead. And Teo of Brindle Lane, first of the Flu children of Saltern Row to be written into a human family's book, holder of bridges, witness of Carthan, keeper of a dead tether and a red scarf and a rule about horn spoons that his mother had absolutely made up, stood in the middle of the town that had feared him longest, and bent and kissed the top of her head with enormous care, and said the thing he had practiced 3 seasons to say without asking anyone's permission, including his own. Then I'm home, he said. Both doors open, no one on watch, and no one was. That was the ending the Hollow told ever after, the part that made hard old dockhands clear their throats at the telling. Not the bridge, not the verdict, not the mark fed to the tide. Just a young woman and her huge quiet son standing easy in a market crowd on a bright market day, watching a small girl in a too big red scarf run the square like she owned it, while around them 400 people who had finally learned the difference between size and danger, went about their shopping, and the lane up the hill stood empty, and the gate stood unlatched, and nothing in the wide world was coming that could not knock.